Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. My name is Jamie Price. I am the director of Viana's dissertation and the committee. The other two committee members are Julie Shedd, the associate dean of ESCAR, now Fuertes, who is a friend of ESCAR from the School of Interfaith Studies. This is one of those great days after the end of a long labor of love and courage and perseverance, all totally true in Viana's case. And her work, as you know, is on the disengagement of radicals in Indonesia. And we're here to discuss her work, find out about her findings, and challenge her a little bit. I think Viana's work exemplifies what's best about ESCAR. I mean, one of the things that's best about ESCAR is the way it brings extraordinary people from all over the world to work on what John Burton called deep-rooted conflict, or some of the thorniest conflict issues that faces the planet. And that's certainly true in Viana's case, working on the problem of what most people call terrorist behavior, but what she, I think, properly refers to as militant radical behavior in Indonesia. So that's one thing, bringing an extraordinary woman like Viana from Indonesia here to work on this program. The other thing about ESCAR is that by a combination of necessity and choice, it's really resolutely interdisciplinary and methodologically pluralist. There are lots of things that go on here in lots of ways. And this Viana's project, this is an example of that. And that's partly because conflict is, as you all know, a very complex phenomenon. So it takes, or one can, come at it from all different kinds of disciplinary perspectives. Sociology, political science, religion, anthropology, philosophy, legal studies. And so it's a major challenge for students, delightful for faculty, of course, but a major challenge for students who have to identify their question in this field and fight their way through to a methodology that works and argue in light of all of the other ones. So they have to master a whole body of knowledge to go at a concrete issue that's of moment to all of us, and that's true of Viana as well. She, with a great deal of work, identified her question, which is, what's going on for former militant radicals when they change their minds about using violence to achieve their ends? Viana has bigger questions than that. She'd like to end terrorist behavior in Indonesia, radical behavior in Indonesia, and help community organizations know how to do that. But as we always say to our students, you don't do your life's work in a dissertation, you begin to build a foundation for it, and narrow it in a way so that you can actually finish and go on to do that life's work. So, but in answering that question, what's going on for former militants when they're changing their minds, Viana worked through various analytical frameworks: rational choice theory, relative deprivation, human needs theory, as well as the de-radicalization and disengagement literature. And she found it wanting and settled on the insight approach, which is a decade or so old, was pioneered here at ESCAR, that decade or so old in the conflict field at any rate. It has its roots in phenomenology of consciousness that go back, and in philosophy that go back a long way. But the application particularly to conflict is relatively new, and Viana employed the insight approach in a very targeted and innovative way. And even though her dissertation itself is 700 pages long. So basically, what the insight approach brings to the table is the notion that we all have minds. We all use them. We use them for lots of things. One of the things we use them for is to decide to engage in conflict behavior and to change our minds about that. And so whenever you have a phenomenon in which one of the major variables is how people are using their minds, it's useful to think about that. And so that's how Viana decided to go at this question, which he's wondering about in particular, is, well, what were former radicals doing when they were changing their minds and when they were deciding not to use violence to get at their ends, but other things? And of course, that's a cornerstone for answering a lot of other questions. And so I'll turn this over to Viana now, who will tell us what she did, why she did it, and what she discovered. So.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you, everyone. First of all, good afternoon. I know that many of you coming from all over places, Massachusetts, Vermont, Baltimore, New York. Thank you very much. And thank you for the three of my committee for all of the efforts and work that invested on me. And thank you for trusting me in the program. Thank you. So before I start my presentation, I make a short video just to provide you. I know there are many Indonesians here. They're a good crowd, and thank you. But I want to play the videos about terrorism in Indonesia to provide for any of you who's not familiar with terrorism in Indonesia. It's 8 minutes long, but hopefully will provide you a background why I'm interested in the project and why this project is personal to me at some point. Right? Thank you. Every student who comes to the School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution has a personal reason for pursuing a PhD. I did too. As a native Indonesian, I vividly remember Laskar Jihad radicals fundraising in Yogyakarta street corners with slogans such as, "Help, our jihadis in Ambon," or "Jihad is our way." I was only in my teens when I witnessed jihadi warriors leaving Indonesia to fight in Afghanistan. This encounters drew my attention to the subject of radical politics and terrorism in Indonesia, and certainly awakened my commitment to do something about it. It was October 12, 2002. 3 explosions occurred simultaneously in Bali. The first 2 explosions hit the 2 nightclubs located on Legian Street, and the third explosion occurred in front of the U.S. Consulate office. 202 people were killed and hundreds injured. The majority of victims were foreigners. Indonesian police named 3 individuals as the main actors: Imam Samudra, Ali Gufron, and Amrozi. On November 9, 2008, the trio was sentenced to death. To commemorate this tragedy, the Indonesian government built a memorial called Panca Benua, or widely known as Ground Zero Bali. August 5, 2003, another suicide bomb occurred at the JW Marriott in Jakarta. The explosion killed 18 people and injured hundreds. Jemaah Islamiyah claimed responsibility for the attack. I returned to the United States in August 2009, just few weeks after the second terrorist attack hit the JW Marriott and Ritz-Carlton in Kuningan, Jakarta on July 17, 2009. I live only a few miles from the explosion. 17 people were killed and hundreds were injured. Nurdin M. Top, the Jemaah Islamiyah leader, was responsible for both the 2003 and 2009 attack.
Police in Indonesia say 2 convicted militants were part of the group which launched yesterday's attacks in Jakarta, leaving 2 people dead along with the 5 attackers. 3 people were arrested this morning, and raids were also carried out across the country to round up suspects.
This city is bouncing back. On the exact site of yesterday's attack, and just 24 hours on, Jakarta United fans led a rowdy vigil declaring, "We're not afraid," in the face of jihadist terror. They sang the national anthem. In some of the shots, you get a good look at the gunmen. We know the identity of the man in black with the red backpack. Police say his name is Sunakim, aka Afif. There are photographs of him too. Police say he was arrested in 2010 at what they call a terrorist training camp. They say he was further radicalized while in jail. Now Afif's dead. This is Santoso, the Islamist leader there, who the police chief says is linked to the Jakarta attack. He's Indonesia's most wanted man, target number one in a huge security operation. Santoso has pledged allegiance to Islamic State militants.
In 2014, Indonesian ISIS sympathizer Bahrum Shah, also known as Abu Muhammad al-Indonesi, released a video inviting all Muslims in Indonesia, Malaysia, and Southeast Asian countries to join ISIS and establish an Islamic caliphate. Bahrum Shah's name was also mentioned by the Indonesian police as the funder of the bombing in 2016. He, along with his Indonesian colleagues Bahru Naim and Salim Mubarak, were in fact ISIS commanders who planned terror in Indonesia. Bahrum Shah was killed in Palmyra city while carrying explosive material targeting Syrian troops. Meanwhile, ISIS attack by new or former JI members continue in Indonesia.
Indonesia have marched against the governor of Jakarta, accusing him of insulting the Quran. Angry protesters organized a rally in the heart of the capital to demand his resignation. The Christian governor, known as Ahok, has faced a backlash after he dismissed a Quranic verse, which his opponents used to suggest a non-Muslim should not be governor of the city. Police are also investigating the case for blasphemy.
Police have regained control of the high-security prison near Jakarta. 156 inmates, most of them detained on terrorism charges, managed to take over 3 of the 6 prison blocks on Tuesday. The rioting prisoners took 6 policemen hostage and killed 5 of them in what commanders described as brutal murders. 1 was later released. ISIL claims responsibility for the hostage siege.
Approach a security post at the police headquarters of Indonesia's second largest city, Surabaya. Within seconds, they detonate bombs. 4 of them are instantly killed, while 10 officers and civilians are injured. Suddenly, a young girl belonging to the family of suicide bombers rises from the rubble. Latest in a series of attacks that have rocked the city in just 24 hours. On Sunday morning, another local family, pictured here in a family portrait, unleashed horror on the streets in coordinated attacks on Christian parishioners. It began when the father, described by police as the head of the ISIS-affiliated group Jemaah Ansharut Daulah in East Java, dropped off his wife and 2 young daughters, aged 9 and 12, outside a church. Dressed in abayas and strapped with explosives, they walked towards the entrance before being chased by a guard. Moments later, they blow themselves up. A short time later, the 46-year-old father drives his car laden with bombs into another church, killing himself and many innocent civilians. And then his 2 sons, aged 16 and 18, weave their way on a motorbike into a crowd outside a 3rd church and detonate more bombs. Mother of the man who orchestrated the church bombing said, "My son told me to pray for his martyrdom a long time ago. I told him, don't tell me that, but it was his dream to become a martyr." Explosions also went off overnight at the house of another family. Police believe they were plotting an attack. ISIS has claimed responsibility, describing each of the bombings as a martyrdom operation.
Now, a question remains. What led formerly radicalized Indonesians to change their minds about engaging in acts of violence and terror to achieve their goals? This research will answer some part of it.
All right. So as I posted on the last clip that the purpose of this research is to find an answer what led formerly radicalized Indonesians to engage in act of violence to achieve their goal. So I'm trying to keep it short, but if I'm too long, please just give me a sign. I'll try to keep it brief. This is my questions. And I conducted my research in West Java. Now, why I choose West Java? For those who are not familiar with Indonesia, this is the map of Indonesia. As you can see, we have 17,000 islands, but West Java is only a small part of it. We have 34 provinces, and the rest is just different area and regions, so it's very rigorous. Now, I choose West Java because of several reasons. First, its close proximity to the nation capital, Jakarta, and also that West Java has been fighting for terrorism since the country was established in 1945. I actually listed on my dissertation the number of cases that we have related to terrorist attack in Indonesia, and if you can trace each of them, half of them always related with West Java. For example, either the case occurred in West Java, the network related with someone in West Java, recruited in West Java, being trained in West Java, or the network somehow related to West Java network. So that driven my attention, why then I'm focusing my attention into West Java. Now, the last reason why I choose West Java is, starting from 1945, we have an Islamic organization, Darul Islam, that want to establish an Islamic state, but it never happened, and the struggle still continue, except that even up until now, there's still many Islamic organizations in West Java, such as Darul Islam, Jama'ah Ansarud Daulah, Jama'ah Islamiyah fractions, and many more Islamic organizations that still fighting for the same purpose. Now, to be brief for this research, I was wondering what kind of terms should I use for all my respondents that actually involved in this a certain violence. And I was debating, should I use jihadis, mujahid, radicals, extremists, terrorists? So I know there are many scholars. Even here in the US, we have conceptual debate. For example, scholars like Daniel Bayman describe jihadis or mujahid as someone to go to holy war. Dr. Bartoli, the previous director, for example, highlighted that when he mentioned about extremists, violence is usually someone that involved in the violence using the religion. President Obama refused to use the term of Islamic extremism, and for many reasons. So there are so many debates. I remember one professor at Georgetown University. He is the head of the Counterterrorism Center at the George Washington University. He said, actually, if you live in the region, it doesn't matter. You call radical, extremist, jihadis, mujahid. Everyone in the region know what you're talking about. You're not pointing out to all Muslim, like I have many Muslim friends out here, and they're the witness. It's not. We know specific people that are involved in violence and using the religion as a violence. So for that reason, during the preliminary research, I actually asked my respondent, what would be fair to call you at this point? So the result is, my respondent is so proud to be called jihadist or mujahid because that has the purpose or goal for what they're trying to achieve. They don't mind to be called radical just because radical, they say they're good radical and bad radical, but they were hesitant to be called extremists and terrorists. Why? Because according to them, the two terms was, like representing Western value. That's not something that coming out from them. It doesn't have any purpose for them. So for the purpose of this research, I called them radical, and to explain their journey, I called jihadis as they refer themselves. Okay, so now, if you read a lot of literature at the Indonesian counterterrorism or terrorism studies, a lot of them relies on rational choice theory. So what is rational choice theory? Rational choice theory usually relies on the structure of the society that give rise into a conflict. For example, because they're poor, then there is deprivation and there is a violence. rational choice theory, basically relying on the analysis of the social structure and not the conflict behavior itself. Well, in this research, what I want to focus is specifically highlighting on each individual, on the decision-making processes, what make them actually really shifting their behavior from their own perspective instead of from the perspective of the social system. So I was fortunate to come to ESCAR back in 2009, and Dr. Price was my academic advisor from the get-go, and from him I learned from the first hand about insight methodology. And after I learned insight is something new for me on my academic journey. I have a background in political science, so I'm familiar with rational choice theory, or deprivation theory or basic needs theory, but insight is something that I learned when I came to ESCAR. So after learning the methodology, I realized that I think it will suit well with my research, just because I'm not looking to analyze the social system or deprivation, but I'm analyzing on the perspective of individual itself who are in conflict. So that's my reason that I choose insight theory. So for many of you maybe not familiar, what is insight? I'm trying to explain it in a simple way and just as I understand it. So insight approach basically first introduced by two scholars from University of Toronto, Malchin and Pritchard, basically is highlighting on the threat of care. So basically when something that we care being threatened, then the reaction would be a conflict, because you're trying to defend something that you care. And that's how the conflict escalates, and that's what causing conflict into or maybe society, to at probably small level society, probably at the broader level. So insight approach give me a framework to understand the decision that made by my respondent, in this case former radicals in Indonesia, what actually they're trying to achieve personally, and what is the decision-making processes. Now, so what is insight approach? Insight approach first came from Bernard Lonergan's thought, and he's a philosopher that focusing on human knowing and basically how our mind is working while we making a decision processes. Now, sometimes we take it for granted. We didn't realize that every second actually our mind is working. Even when I just stand here and do my PowerPoint, I know that there is a cycle that is in my mind going on, and Lonergan frame it into 4 steps of the decision processes, starting from experiencing, understanding, judging, and then deciding. And then Dr. Price explored more with insight approach, and he, instead of having 4 steps, he actually expanding into 7 steps, not only using the experiencing, understanding, but he break up the 2 steps, verifying and then valuing, to become as one of the Lonergan point, and then deliberating and evaluating, and then deciding. So then what is the difference between Lonergan and Dr. Price? The loop, because it's heading the same way. It heading into the decision-making processes. But I thought Dr. Price trying to give more time, to give, I think what Megan Price called in her dissertation is like snapshot moment, to actually contemplate decision-making processes. And it will probably it will change, but probably will not change the final decision, but it will give us time to contemplate. Okay, so now I'm trying to go to field research. Hopefully you're still comfortable with this. And yeah, so the field research, this is an interesting part for me just because I spend, well actually I know all of my respondents when I work for the, as a contractor for the Department of Defense, but I knew them since 2012, but I was afraid to make a contact with them. I don't know, I'm just afraid. I can't hide it, just afraid. But in 2015, after I passed my proposal, then I know that I need to establish a contact with them at some point. Then I have to start contacting them. And then I used to manage 35 journalists in Indonesia. Working for me for the previous job. So from them I get all of this contact and I start contacting them through WhatsApp, Google Hangout, and sometimes Skype, depends whatever available for them. And then I start to make an interview while waiting for my IRB, Institutional Review Board. This is the permission from GMU usually to conduct research. So I interview them as part of my preliminary research, and then I transcribe them and then translate them. I interview 19, but then at the end I only use 10 because there are a few cases that I think they're similar, and I would rather to have a case like a uniquely different, although there's some cross-cutting, but still related. Also, during the field research, which is done in July 2017, I have face-to-face interaction with them, although I already interviewed them in person, but somehow the answer is just completely different sometimes. So that was a challenging part for me. And for confidentiality, well, I would like to thank you, Dr. Fuertes. I remember the first time we met, you told me specifically, please ask IRB that you can get a verbal consent. And that was really important, just because most of my respondents ended up, they don't want to sign the paper that they agree. Among 19 respondents, in fact, only 2 of them were agreed. The rest, they don't want to sign. And for that reason, it was very useful from the get-go to know that verbal consent is much more required. And well, after in Indonesia, I do research. I met them in person. I asked them, and I stay at the Holiday Inn. That's not without the purpose. Holiday Inn, although it's like a American chain hotel, but unlike Ritz-Carlton or JW Marriott, which pretty much representing the American culture or American superiority, I don't know what you call. But Holiday Inn, most visitors are Indonesian, and initially I want to go to every respondent. I want to see with my eyes how they interact with the family, with the society, with their friends. But I just realized that although it's West Java, it can be like between 6 until 7 hours to get into one place, and they're so scattered. Each location is different, and with traffic, it can last longer. And I also nervous about the security, meeting them in person. Well, I do not know them in person, I just know them through the communication that we have. So I decided to actually invite them into Holiday Inn and then interview them in there. Another problem is just the lack of security of the hotel. We have metal detector, but no one actually passed the metal detector. So that's kind of raised a concern for me. And I spoke to the manager of the hotel. Is it possible for me to ask you to tighten the security? But the manager was kind enough to basically accommodate my needs. Not only that they tighten the security, but also adding one camera where I sit, so they can check on me once in a while. So that was a good treat that helped me feeling safe at least. And yeah, the research difficulties. I have, as I mentioned in my proposal, I previously initiated to interview 5 women radicals. Well, unfortunately, it didn't happen. First, for 2 reasons. Because in my IRB, I'm not allowed to pay them. But this woman said that, well, I'm willing to be interviewed if my husband gives me permission. which finally I called them, and the husband said, oh yeah, you can interview them if you pay them. So for that reason, I decided to not use women. So this is something, good challenge for other scholars to maybe explore more. Although if I have a time, I want to go back because this is something that I thought would be valuable to explore. And the analysis. So basically, based on the loop that I have previously, this is the analysis that I have. I analyze based on the key analysis for each respondent, because every respondent make 4 or 3, sometimes 2 key decision making in their journey from radicalism to return to society. So I use this analysis. Dr. Price actually helped me to find this, helped me to categorize this based on the ultimate goal, and then the downside, the other option considered evaluating the chosen option, and then the result of the decision. So the finding is kind of interesting because I thought that something will be aligned with my thought or my hypothesis earlier, but a lot of unpredictable things happen. So the decision of factor of involvement in terrorism usually different for everyone, starting from family, the recruitment, the network is different. I will discuss while we go along for each respondent. But the way how they value jihad in radicalism is also different. I have many Indonesian fellows here. I want to play this audio, but I would like some volunteer out here. Maybe Ibu Maria can help me to translate this after the quote in Indonesian, just to show authentic quote.
Dalam jihad itu tidak boleh sedikit pun ada unsur keduniaan. Kita misalkan di medan jihad, kita ini niatnya lillah karena Allah. Tidak supaya kita nanti dikatakan sebagai pahlawan, supaya kita dikatakan sebagai mujahid, supaya kita dikatakan percaya dan lain sebagainya. Itu tidak boleh semuanya. Ada niat-niat yang seperti itu berarti niat mencederai jihad. Adapun ketika nanti di medan jihad ini dapat ghanimah, itu berkah daripada jihad. Nah, boleh jadi tujuan. Misalkan, kan saya juga dengar, entah benar atau tidak kan, kalau ke sana nanti 1 bulan ini dapat segini dolar Amerika. Nah, itu sudah lurus lagi kalau itu yang diharapkan. Gitu. Nah,
Okay, Bu Maria, silahkan.
Okay, I'll just try my best. Okay, so according to what he said, that jihad is not something for heroism, it's for Allah. And then it is also said that jihad is not for personal gain, again it's for Allah. If that is the goal, then it's not jihad. And in doing so, maybe they got some booty or spoils of war, the term for that. But then it's not the goal. That's not the goal, but that's the side effect, or it becomes the blessing for the person.
Yeah.
That's my understanding.
Okay, thank you. But yes, that's what exactly is. So yeah, basically jihad has a purpose. It's not just you go for war and expecting something. So there are a lot of rumor that if you go to Syria among Indonesian itself, and that's how they recruit many people in Indonesia, that with the promising of the receiving a certain return. And according to this person, that's not jihad. Okay, so and then the finding will be also that discuss about the value of jihad after their return to society, their involvement on the de-radicalization program, ISIS relation, as well as the experience as Afghan combatants, and the possibility in the future in the violent action. Now I want to go one by one, hopefully briefly. Okay, so respondent 1. Respondent 1 is interesting because he is the one that actually campaigning for many de-radicalization program right now in Indonesia and at the University of Indonesia. So the profile of respondent 1, he the key decision that he made was he went to Afghanistan, and then not only that, he also left Afghanistan to become a trainer for MILF, probably Dr. Fuertes, yes, no, yeah, Moro Islamic Liberation Front, yeah. And then he became the commander of the Mantiki 3 for Jamaah Islamiyah. For those who are not familiar, what Mantiki 3 is, Jamaah Islamiyah territory, but covering the region of Indonesia, Malaysia, and Philippines, and then and the Philippines. Sorry, and then he became an educator. He worked with the Indonesian university, one of the Ivy League in Indonesia, if you may, and that's how I have the quote, how he then changed his mind, his turning point. So I think I want to ask a volunteer here, maybe Ray. He's American, but he speaks Indonesian very well. So, okay, Ray, can you please translate after the quote, okay?
Waktu saya ditangkap, barangkali ini ada hikmahnya yang kemudian Allah menginginkan saya melihat begitu. Polisi hanya menangkap para pelakunya saja. Lalu kemudian yang saya lihat sendiri di antara anggota polisi yang menjaga ibadah Islamnya, ya antara lain seperti ibadah sholatnya, kemudian ibadah puasanya, selain puasa Ramadan, mereka juga melakukan puasa Senin dan Kamis begitu, sehingga membuat hati saya tersentuh, ya. Akhirnya saya juga masih pikir-pikir untuk membuka bicara. Ya, tidak mudah untuk saya menjawab. Padahal polisi bertanya nama saja saya nggak menjawab. Ya, nama kamu siapa? Saya cuma jawab astagfirullah. Kamu orang mana? Astagfirullah. Kamu dari mana? Astagfirullah. Ya, untuk tujuan apa kamu di sini? Astagfirullah. Semua pertanyaan adalah astagfirullah. Kira-kira kalau Mbak Viana dibuat begitu jengkel nggak? Tapi saya tetap juga tidak mau. Dalam saya tidak menjawab itu, saya berpikir dan terus berpikir macam-macam ayat Allah SWT yang keluar dalam pikiran saya, sehingga saya mau bicara. Karena saya melihat ya bahwa jamaah Islamiyah yang keliru itu bukan polisinya. Angkut melakukan aksi yang di luar dari tuntunan Islam, mereka salah. Polisi hanya menjalankan tugasnya.
Okay, Ray.
So it started out saying perhaps there was wisdom behind it when he was arrested by the police, and that Allah wants me to remember his journey. And the police only arrested those involved in acts of violence. And while in prison, he noticed the police and he saw them practicing their religion, whether Muslim or non-Muslim, and they were praying and worshiping, and he saw them fasting as well, and they were fasting during Ramadan, and also fasting every Monday and Thursday every week, and then that really touched his heart, but he still didn't open his mouth. And when he was when he remembered a situation when an Indonesian policeman, he asked him, what's your name? And he replied, Astaghfirullah. And then the police asked him, where are you from? And the same response, Astaghfirullah, which means I seek forgiveness from Allah. And then the policeman asked him, what's your purpose here? Again, Astaghfirullah. And he said, he couldn't talk. And he said, Mrs. Viana, if you were the policeman, you would be annoyed, wouldn't you? And while I didn't provide any answers, he looked deep to his heart and tried to find answers from God, and if there were any. And finally, he decided finally he spoke up and saying that because he witnessed that the police weren't at fault, they didn't commit any acts of violence. It was he realized that the JI members were the ones that committed acts of violence and acts against Islam, and so the police, as he witnessed, they just carried out their duties.
Yeah, thank you. So as you can see, he was actually de-radicalized while in prison. And that's an interesting part for me, actually, to see how he became de-radicalized. And then at the same time, although his valuing doesn't change, but his action is actually the opposite. He's no longer believes that jihad has to do with violence or conducting violence to it. Now, respondent 2. Okay, respondent 2, he has 3 key decisions. First key decision is going to Afghanistan as a jihadist, leaving Afghanistan and then settle in Malaysia. He worked actually with Hambali. Hambali is the person who is currently serving in Guantanamo and waiting for the trial and because of his involvement in 9/11. And respondent 2 cooperating with the Indonesian government. Now you can see out here, respondent 2 is kind of interesting character because while he was in Malaysia, he actually worked for Hambali. He didn't know, he never been arrested in Indonesia. He never conduct any violence in Indonesia. But what he did was he was just doing what Hambali told him to do, to pick up people from the airport, and there's this massive people, actually more than dozens of people that he picked up from the airport, and they're from Malaysia, from Pakistan, from Iraq, from Afghanistan, and from other places, but he was told by Hambali to not talk to them or to not have conversation with them. And then when he was arrested in Malaysia under ISA, which stands for International Security Act in Malaysia, he was confused why he was arrested until he saw the news that obviously those people that he picked up from the airport was the hijackers of the 9/11. So then he went to Indonesia, he went back to Indonesia, and he decided to cooperate with the Indonesian government for specifically de-radicalization program so he can share his experience. And I thought his journey was interesting for something that he probably didn't know, and he valued differently, but that was his journey. He's now working with many de-radicalization program in Indonesia. So he has the same thing. His value doesn't change. He still value jihad. He still value, that we should help oppressed Muslim, but his action is different. Now, respondent 3. Respondent 3 is also kind of special because we were talking about rational choice theory and why I don't think rational choice theory will be my first option in this one, because someone like respondent 3 coming from a wealthy family, actually, his family mostly are from the military, from the Indonesian military, or many of them working as the official at the Indonesian National Petroleum Company, which is locally known as Pertamina. He has a hobby, which is gun shooting. Even though gun is prohibited in Indonesia, but because he has a military member, his hobby become kind of prominent, and that's why he know what it called Cipinang people, in quote, Cipinang people. It's like a black market where they actually selling guns. And with this network that he has, and then at the same time, he was radicalized while in the mosque, or have an interaction through the people while in the mosque. He then quit his work as the bank employee. So he's the staff at the Bank Danamon. It was a private bank in Indonesia, and it's still kind of big entity in Indonesia. No, he thought that he could not working in the bank anymore just because it against Quran, because it has the profit. When the interest from the bank is prohibited in Islam. And if you notice now, there are a lot of Sharia bank in Indonesia right now, as the movement to oppose this notice that we better using a bank that not taking advantage from people because it's haram. So no, he has two key important decisions. He left his job as an employee of the bank and then to cooperate with the Indonesian government. But this doesn't happen quickly. He went through all of the punishment because he went to Aceh to supply all of the weaponry in Aceh, where there was a training camp in Aceh, in Janto specifically. And then, after that, he received a sentence, and after that, while in prison, his wife got sick and finally died, and he has 3 kids, and that was like the pressure for him to actually engage with the government and so that he can take care of his family. Respondent 4 is well-educated Indonesian scholar studying at the University of West Java, and he at some point involved in radicalism because he was recruited by someone named Ustadz Yahya, but actually it was Dulmatin. Dulmatin is the perpetrator of the Bali bombing, but he didn't know the name until Dulmatin was actually being arrested and killed by the Indonesian police later on in the year. So he involved in 3 decisions that he made. First, to go to Ambon and wage jihad, and then going to Palestine. That was his final goal, to conduct jihad, and then helping the Indonesian government. Now, how this thing turned, what is his turning point? Well, apparently while he was in prison, he spoke with a lot of clerics, and he then realized that it's completely different process, and thought that most people believe about Islam and that jihad actually can be conducted without any violence. And that was Respondent 5 and Respondent 4. Respondent 5 have 3 key important decisions. His profile is interesting to me because he's native Jakartan. He went to Afghanistan early at the beginning of the Afghan war. But then he also taught in Afghanistan, training many mujahid before he decided to go to return to Indonesia. And then after he returned, he also still very close with the Jamaah Islamiyah network, and he built a massive support for religious conflict then in Ambon. And then he was arrested under the allegation of his involvement, bank robbery in this bank, bank robbery. And then he was sentenced and served in prison. Now, I think his profile is interesting to me because he said that he's willing to work with the government, but I thought a lot of de-radicalization program in Indonesia doesn't really change him. It doesn't really help him to return to society because of the branding of former terrorists still like haunted him. He has to move from one place to another place because the society always branding him with a label as a terrorist. And he said specifically that he will be not conduct any violence with 2 conditions. First, that Muslim is not oppressed, and second, that a lot of leaders, Indonesian leaders, must be Muslim. So this is his quote. Pak Alek, can you please help me to translate the quote after?
Sekarang konsep jihad Bapak seperti apa, dan apakah Bapak sudah merasa memenuhi panggilan itu sebagai seorang Muslim? Panggilan jihad itu tetap ada di dalam hati sanubari saya. Selama umat Islam tidak pernah didolimi oleh orang kafir, saya tidak akan mengusir. Tapi kalau umat Islam itu didolimi, diperangi, saya tetap bagaimanapun nggak bisa menerima. Itu iman saya nggak seperti itu. Saya nggak mau usil sama orang-orang kafir, cuma kita mengingatkan saja. Kalau seandainya mereka macam-macam sama kita, apalagi sampai terjadi kita dibunuh, masa kita harus tinggal diam, Mbak? Kan nggak mungkin, Mbak. Kita harus bela diri.
Ya, Pak Alex lah.
The question is whether his view of jihad is changed after he's been detained. And basically he said that deep in his heart it doesn't change at all. Yeah. He said that basically if infidels, he calls infidels, didn't bother us, didn't bother him, the Muslims, he's fine with it. He won't go to any war with them. But all over the world there's a war against Islam, and there's a murder toward Muslims. He won't let this happen. So basically, he wants to Muslims wants to defend themselves.
Okay, terima kasih Pak. Thank you. Okay, so respondent 5, So respondent 5, his behavior changing, his ideology changing with a quote, you know, if, right? And now I have respondent, why? Okay, respondent 6. Yeah, respondent 6 has a three key important decision. That is, you know, to go to Palopo, South Sulawesi, and to train jihadis in Poso. If you don't know Palopo, probably you hear about the tsunami that recently occurred in Indonesia. That's in that region, and Poso is not far from Palopo. The purpose of the training jihad in Palopo is so it's disguised for the Indonesian government. It's not easily to track. And then he also conducted an attack at the Myanmar embassy in 2013. And you know, he decided to leave radicalism and supporting anti-terrorism because he realized that actually while in prison there are a lot of massive recruitment for the cleric called Abdurrahman Amir and Aman Abdurrahman, and yeah, and he becoming worried, and he realized that you know, he should do something for it, and he decided to be involved in the radicalization program, of course, after serving some years in prison. And then respondent 7 is also interesting because he's a well-educated personnel. He's graduated as an engineer from Indonesian Ivy League, the Institute of Bandung Technology, or ITB, locally known as ITB, and he basically made 2 important decisions to launch simultaneous attack at 3 places. You know, at Makobrimob, which is the command headquarters, and then the regional police in Jakarta, as well as at the Danish embassy. The Danish embassy, I don't know if you remember the cartoon that portray Muhammad, and a lot of many radicals in Indonesia, they don't like that. And that's why the purpose of them targeting the Danish embassy at that time. And then what turned him into, you know, choose to be not conducting violence is because while in prison, he actually have a lot of dialogue, and he was being trusted by many inmates because, you know, a lot of people actually appreciate him. And not only that, he was helping many inmates from literacy. So for that, he got a remission from the Indonesian government, and he becoming one of the key person for the Indonesian government in conducting de-radicalization program in Indonesia. Respondent 8. Respondent 8 is interesting because he initially worked as a florist at the hotel named Mulia, but then he specifically resigned, then working at the Ritz-Carlton with the purpose of knowing the map at the Ritz-Carlton hotel. And so that's why the explosion was precisely happened in the designated area when they're targeting, because they already know the mapping. And he also participated with 2009, but he also funding it. He actually spent money for it for about, I mean, it was 50 million in Indonesian rupiah, but it could be more with the currency right now we have. Basically, when I interviewed him, he said, you know, why FBI interviewed you? And he said, well, because you know, they want to know where the money came from. And I asked him where the money came from. Well, he said, well, they don't know. They thought that it was from funding somewhere, but it was me. Apparently, he got a loan from the bank to fund terrorism. And then, you know, finally, Respondent 8 then claimed himself as being de-radicalized and now working as the cab driver. And then he worked with the Indonesian government with an exception if all leaders are Muslim. And then I have Respondent 9. Yep, he has key important decision, 3, going to Afghanistan, he's going to Ambon and Poso to wage jihad, and he's also participating in the Bali bombing. In fact, he's the commander, field commander of the Bali bombing in 2002, and he's also the bomb maker. And while I conducting interview with him, he was still serving in prison because he was sentenced to life in prison. But he claimed, although I am physically still in prison, but I'm already de-radicalized because his thought is changing. His thought was changing when he was on the run, actually, not while he was in the prison. When he was on the run, he thought, you know, he saw on TV how the explosion that he made was, and how many people were killed. He actually felt guilty, and then now he decided to involve in de-radicalization program in Jakarta. So although he's still in prison, but many times Indonesian government will let him to you know, share his experience in certain event. And I have his quote a little bit, almost done. So I hope, Ibu Sita, maybe you can help me to translate it after this.
Itu 91 member. Nah, kami kan dengar bahwa kakak kelas kami biasanya itu begitu habis belajar 1 semester itu prakteknya langsung terjun di medan perang langsung. Nah, waktu itu kami pas datang itu masih ada perang, Kabul dan sekitarnya. Nah, ketika kami sudah mendekati ujian itu kami sudah siap-siap. Siapa yang kepengen langsung ke medan perang, kami berdaftar sudah. Kami daftar, sudah siap-siap, sudah mau diberangkatkan, ternyata Kabul menang, istilahnya foto Kabul, istilahnya komunis sudah kalah. Nah, waktu itu akhirnya nggak jadi kami. Kami sedih, kami menangis semua, nggak jadi terjun ke medan perang langsung. Terjun ke medan perang saya langsung itu cita-cita kami kan gitu. Bukan cita-cita ya, tapi keinginan kami. Nah, jadi istilahnya apa? Mujahidin secara langsung. Syukur-syukur kalau dapat syahid kan gitu. Makanya ketika sudah nggak ada kan akhirnya kita sedih.
Oke, silahkan Bu.
So he basically said that he arrived in Afghanistan in September 1991, and he had heard that the previous cohort usually joined the war zone after one semester of training, and when he arrived, it was the war was still ongoing, and surrounding Kabul area, and when the exam approached, they were getting ready. They were getting ready to be deployed. But when the time prior to the departure, it was when the communists lost and Kabul fell into the Taliban. So actually, they were very sad and crying because it was their biggest wish to wage war in the name of jihad. And I'm trying to remember what he said. Yeah. And they wanted to be mujahid actually, and it was their wish also to die as martyrs, and losing the opportunity made them very, very sad.
Yeah. Well, thank you. So yeah, for many of them, jihad has a goal and has a purpose. The last one, respondent 10 is the youngest among the 10 respondents. Now, he was arrested because he was protecting 2 of his uncles, not 1, 2, because the 2 were the perpetrators of the Marriott bombing in 2009, Marriott Ritz-Carlton bombing. And he decided to become a business entrepreneur right now. But the funny thing is, a few months before I interviewed him, he actually trying to leave Indonesia using East Timor. So he never involved in de-radicalization program in Indonesia. He's probably the only, well, actually two of my respondents that barely involved in de-radicalization program in Indonesia. So I think that's all. Well, I will summarize. So the limitation of my research and also probably like the suggestion for any scholar who wants to follow up the research. So prison has created more radicalized individual, but also at the same time, the respondent that I have was radicalized while in prison. So why and what triggered this? Maybe you know, other scholars can explore on this. And then the role of women, as I promised that I will interview 5 women individual for this research. I couldn't make it. Maybe someone else can continue explore on this. And then will Indonesian government prevent a lot of people who are currently in Syria and then return to Indonesia? So not repeating what happened with many mujahid in Afghanistan. That's also another question that we can follow up. And leadership, because a lot of them saying, or most of my respondents, in fact, saying that if we unite and get the leader, we can take over Indonesia and establish an Islamic state, because that was their final goal. And then the geography-based studies, as I mentioned earlier, that I only pick one province among 34 provinces in Indonesia, and it's only a small part. But a place like East Java, for example, is a good place because a massive recruitment also happened in East Java or Central Java. So there's still a lot of things to be done, and my study is only small of them. So hopefully there are more and more people exploring this topic, and we can have some peace. I think that's all. Thank you, and if you have any questions, I give it back to Dr. Price. Thank you.
We'll have a few questions and comments first from the committee, and then turn it open to the floor. We have kind of a hard time deadline. The committee will have to leave and meet and deliberate about Viana and the defense in 13 or so minutes, and so we don't have a whole lot of time. But she can stay, and you can stay and continue the conversation when we need to step out. So Al, do you want to launch us?
Okay. You want me to just bring this out once and for all? You might need to write this down.
Okay.
Viana. Okay. So first, thank you and congratulations. Your study really generated a strong interest in me because we are neighbors, Indonesia, Philippines, and I very much also I was very much familiar with the whole process of radicalization and de-radicalization in the Philippines. I'm also very much involved with the DDR of the with the Office of the Presidential Advisor in the peace process, and so that was something that I could right away connect with your study. So I have, let me just say 3 comments / question. Okay. Number 1 is, I'm very much curious as to whether the shift in people's minds from being radical to being de-radicalized, did it come or did it happen with a sense of consciousness or intentionality, like someone would say, I have to change, or did the shift or shifts kind of happen more spontaneously? You know, in other words, because I think I do believe that sometimes mental shifts happen without the person really conscious about it, you know? So I wonder what your findings, you know, would tell you on this regard. And then the other question is, in light of what you have presented, are you saying then that de-radicalization and disengagement always go hand in hand? Can someone be de-radicalized, but at the same time maintain his or her engagement, but not necessarily as violent as what it was before? Maybe before it was on the red zone, really part of the extremely militant and aggressive violence, but now maybe on the white zone, you know, more as a courier.
Yeah.
You know, but still maintaining that sense of radicalization, except that there was just a shift in the degree of engagement. Or does it always have to be like once you are being de-radicalized, then disengagement follows, or vice versa? And then the last item is really more of a comment, because after the 2004 tsunami, and years following that, I have an ongoing work in Banda Aceh and Nias, and I also work in Jogja with the Duta Wacana Christian University, and I had the opportunity to work with many of the former really kind of groups, you know, that have been fighting against each other, and then but with what happened with tsunami, that actually served as a catalyst for them to come together and then help lay down their arms. I met some of them who said, this has affected us too much. And so the years of all this peace process, which were to no avail, when the tsunami came, it actually kind of paved the way for some of these groups. And of course, this was not part of the parameter of your study.
Yeah.
But I just would like to think if, you know, maybe in the long run, this might also be an additional, a possible dimension to add, perhaps.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. So should I answer first? Okay. Well, thank you very much for the questions, Dr. Fuertes. I think in many ways, I know this is kind of exciting topic for both of us, and yes, I'm excited to answer too.
I'm gonna stop reading your material once it's hard to pull it down.
Okay, so the first question you posed is the shift of people mind being radically to de-radicalized. Is that happen right away, or you know, it comes with the process? The answer, with the consciousness, well, each respondent is different. For example, respondent 1 is not coming right away. He was 11 months in prison while he still keep thinking about it. And every time the police asks him, he just say, Astaghfirullah, because he was, you know, he's still processing what kind of decision making that would be best for him. And I thought, you know, that's why the insight suit well, because he keep, I think in his mind, he's looping, you know, from every decision, like understanding, experiencing, verifying all of the decision before, I mean, evaluating all of this, his experience, while he at the same time observing the police, that the police actually didn't do anything wrong. The police were only capture those who are the bad guys, who are radicals. And I thought his process was an interesting one, that it doesn't change right away. But at the same time, respondent 9 decision was more vivid than respondent 1. Just because while on the run, and then he saw on TV with 1 ton explosive material, what can be done with that? And you know, he finally realized that more than 200 people were killed. So I think everyone has its own experience and journey, whether it's like I said, the process, how our mind working, it can be very vivid, but also it can be slow depending on the how your mind working. I think that's the first answer for your questions. And the second, between de-radicalization and disengagement. Yes, I actually listed the difference between de-radicalization and disengagement on my dissertation. And that's interesting because among those 10 respondents, as I said, do they really de-radicalize or they disengage? Because at least 3 of them, at least they said they're not going to do violence if. So I think disengagement probably is, you know, somehow temporarily, and maybe it's more suited for this. But Indonesian government do not use the term disengagement. They like to use de-radicalization because what they're trying to target is their ideology, which is at some point is a debate, because how can you change people's ideology? But that's what they're really targeting. in many Indonesian literature, you can see the debate that why Indonesian government do not want to use the term disengagement program or counter-violent extremism. They want to have specifically de-radicalization program because they were targeting that they could change ideology. Yeah, and then the third question with the tsunami in Aceh. Yeah, it's interesting case for Aceh because our Indonesian government were struggling with not only radicalism, but also Aceh at some point want to be separated from Indonesia, just echoing what happened in Timor, Timor-Leste. But Indonesian government taking advantage of the tsunami with the help of international community. So that's why the leader of GAM at that time, let me remember his name. Pak Marfi, can you remember the name maybe? Hassan, something Hassan. Hassan Ditiro. Yeah, we make an agreement in Geneva to reach, the peacekeeping and the peacemaking in Aceh, and it actually worked. But it was followed up by the ability of the Indonesian government to provide the demand from Acehnese to apply Sharia law in Aceh. So although Sharia law until now is still very debatable topic for most Indonesian itself, but maybe we can discuss later. Yeah. But I know it's an interesting topic. Okay. Yep.
So similarly, I have a couple questions and comments, and again, congratulations.
Thank you.
It's hard to get this kind of data, and I think one of the challenges in most of the counterterrorism, counter-extremism research is that we so rarely actually hear in a meaningful way from people that have participated and get a chance to dig in, which I think you've been able to do into some of those decision-making processes. And usually we kind of look at this as kind of a black box, right? There's inputs in, and somehow violence comes out on the far end, and I appreciate that you're trying to open the black box to look at what those levers are, and I think that's really an important contribution to what we're doing. I'm appreciative that you spent time thinking about the labels, because I think this is important, and I like that you're getting them to describe them to you. One of the things I've been challenged by is in a lot of this language we're assuming, and I'm curious about this term radicals, because I'm curious about their assumption of themselves as being non-mainstream. Because I think in a lot of these cases, the violent actors don't necessarily have an ideology that's that far out from the norm, right?
Yeah.
But they're just an understanding of what they need to do, or the steps they're willing to take, or the extreme thing, not necessarily the ideology. And so I'm curious that I have yet find a term that I feel comfortable with, and I'm curious if their understanding of themselves as being on the far end of a spectrum, or is it the violence that's making them radical. I like what you were talking about around jihad still being done peacefully as part of the prison conversion. One of my curiosities is that I feel like you have a lot here that could be used to say, as moving forward from a policy perspective, here's the kinds of things we should be pursuing. What's happening in these prison programs? And I think you've left it in the dissertation as here's something that needs to be done further, but I actually think you have a lot of that data, which is to say what's the mechanisms that might be happening in the prisons, and how do we encourage them to happen further? Like what, is it that they had humanized the police? Is it that they, had an opportunity to see the consequences of action? So I feel like you have a little bit more there that you didn't necessarily tease out that I think you could do. And the last thing is maybe just a comment is that I think a lot of times when we get to kind of single causal mechanisms, we're not looking at some of the other inputs. So you make a comment about how you really feel like the dissertation has disproved the idea that economics is driving some of this violence, and I think that's true, that it's not the sole factor. But I am curious about, I guess I feel like that if you're thinking about oppression, and if you're talking about oppression of Muslims as being what they're responding to and feeling the need to react to, I think economics plays a part in that sense of oppression. And so I'm not sure that I agree with the statement that you made, that your dissertation has disproven the idea that economics is involved. I think what you're really saying is that it's not like you can't go do a demographic economic analysis and then explain that poor people are doing violence and richer are not.
Right.
There's another mechanism in there in between, right? Which is that the economics are creating helping to create a sense of oppression along with other things, which is leading people to feel like they need to take action.
Yeah.
So just to kind of be a little cautious about what you've been able to eliminate as causes as well, because oppression's a complicated experience, perception, right?
Yeah. Okay, I think I can clarify that. So I will go from the third questions because I think it is important. I'm not saying that it's wrong or the statement or any argument saying that economy can be a factor is wrong, but the fact is respondent, let me remember, respondents, not 7, let me just to be sure, the one that was an engineer, I think respondent 7. Yeah, respondent 7 is well educated, but he make a quote, something like this. It happened, he became radical just because after he graduated, he didn't get a job right away. And that's why there was a loophole at that point where he was being recruited. He thought it's a good opportunity. And he was getting a salary as a teacher with the low wages. And he said, if the depression could not happen or would not happen at that time, I would not be radical. If I would have get a job right away after I graduated, maybe that could lead me into somewhere else and I will never involve in this radicalism. So yeah, I'm not saying that, or I'm not against the idea that economy could contribute a factor. Yes, it could, but it's not the sole factor. Especially in this research, it's not the only factor why people involved in radicalism. And then for the second questions about prison, yes, it is an interesting one because prison for most Indonesian is a struggle. Because one cell, which should be for 5 people, it can be 40 people in Indonesia. It's so crowded. This is one of the biggest problem for Indonesian government because a lot of, it's just the massive overcrowded prison. So in the video, probably you remember there was a bridge at the prison. Part of it is just because so populated, but at the same time, there also a figure while in prison that usually becoming the, because someone is, for example, the figure of Aman Abdurrahman was a really good scholar, graduated from overseas, and he was respected as an Islamic leader. And he wrote a book and he spread it into prison, and that's why a lot of people were much more radicalized while in prison. But at the same time, many of my respondents apparently was taking a different approach because he also have an opportunity to speak with other clerics that are much more moderate in a way, and that's how he then becoming, or they, because there's more than one, becoming disengaged from their thought, from radicalism. And then the term of radicalism itself, yes, when I asked them, how do you understand about what kind of term I should use, they said, definitely mujahid and jihadist is the 2 terms that make them proud because that's what exactly they want to be described. It has the goal, it has the ideology tendency in there. But when I interviewed them, they said radicalism is like in the gray area because, when you said you're being radical, you can be good radical or bad radical. I can be radical in fighting radicalism itself, and I'm still being radical. That's how they describe it to me. So I think the way they describe radicalism is at the point where extreme to do something or being radical to do something, but not in violence. Yeah, I don't know if, I hope I answered your questions. All right, okay.
Ruthviana, thank you. This is a very rich conversation. It's clearly not done. We need to step out, but I invite you to invite more questions. Or
okay, yeah, okay.
So I would just like another round of applause.
Thank you. If you can introduce yourself before your questions, would be good. Thank you.
My name is Karen Orr. I'm a PhD student here. I'm in my third year, so just finishing the course portion. But I was curious to know, it sounds like of your 10 respondents, quite a number of them actually experienced prison at some point. So I had a couple questions. One was whether or not you saw that as some correlation in terms of the de-radicalization, but also the disengagement. I mean, the sense of like isolation, also maybe not being a part or as well connected with the terrorist group or network. I know that you had mentioned previously that some groups had become, or individuals had become more radicalized within prison. So I don't know if you had made any connections there in terms of that kind of contributing to their just de-radicalization in the sense of having to be accountable and like that accountability piece.
Oh, good question. Yeah, I think most of my respondents among 19 respondents, I only used 10, and all of these 10 people that I interviewed, they already experienced a sentence in prison. And as I mentioned, one of them still in prison because he was sentenced to life for his action in the Bali bombing. Now, to answer about the prison and how the prison could somehow change some of this radical thought, I mean, there are a lot of programs that initiated by the government and also a lot of programs initiated by think tanks such as the Search for Common Ground. They have a massive program in Indonesia trying to help the same program for like a de-radicalization. And then there are a few non-organizational, sorry, I can't even remember, NGO, non-governmental organization in Indonesia that focus on de-radicalization programs such as La Sawardi Biru, and there are many more. They focus in de-radicalization, targeting different kids. You know, like first of all, they're targeting those who are in prison, but second of all, they're also targeting their families because their thought was if they just targeting, they probably can disengage, but if they don't have support from the family, then they can come back. So what they're doing is like trying to educate not only those who are in prison, but at the same time working with their family. For example, they send all of their children to school to educate them and to provide good understanding of Islam and the faith that they believe. And what happened is one of the son of the Bali bombing, in fact, went to Syria at the age of 15 and he was killed. So what can be explained from this case? You know, so of course, it's not true that just because your parents or your relative involved in any attack, then it will affect your family. But as from time to time, the recruitment occurred, as I mentioned, through the family. So it is important to bring the family to also not educate and bring the person, but also the whole family and educate them, you know, with more encouraging to distance themselves from radicalism.
So I guess of the 10 that experienced prison, did each of those prisons have some form of outreach by these NGOs that was trying to de-radicalize them, or how many of them actually had exposure to it?
I don't know how many prisons to be sure, but I know several prisons where my respondents were, such as in Nusa Kambangan, and then Nusa Kambangan is like the Indonesian version of Guantanamo because it's in a specific island and you need to go by boat to get into the prison. But there are also, of course, the prison at the military level or at the police level, like some sort of a detaining place for them, and they have that kind of program. I don't think that every prison has a program because the Indonesian government already put the former radicals in a specific prison. So it's not all prison because we have specific prison for corruptor, for example, you know, a specific prison for those who are involved in drugs. And then the government trying to put all the terrorists or former radicals into the same place with the purpose if they can do a program. de-radicalization program. Yeah. I hope that answers your questions. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah. Yeah.
I'm Chuck Geary. I'm her father-in-law, and I'm from Boston. I don't know if this is a fair analogy, but within the last week or so, at least in Boston, a famous gangster named Whitey Bulger was murdered in prison. And the best the newspapers come up was that he was a snitch. And it happened many years ago, but there was someone else in prison that took offense to it, and they assumed that this is the murderer. So if you are a jihadist and you are de-radicalized, is your life in danger for changing your philosophy? Do other jihadists look upon you as a possible snitch, or maybe as a snitch?
Oh, that's a good question, because that's what many of my respondents experience, actually, because after they decided, for example, Respondent 2 decided to leave the radical group, and then, you know, he specifically stated that he wants to quit Jamaah Islamiyah, then there were many threats facing him. The threat occurred when he go to the meetings or at the hotel, and you know, so this is yeah, the threat can come from the community as well. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, we want to congratulate you.